So, good morning, everyone. My name is John Dund, and I'm a professor at Emory University in the Department of Religion. I'll be moderating this morning's session. Yesterday, we had a very full day, and in many ways, quite an amazing day. We discussed in the afternoon the intersection of the Buddhist practices, Buddhist philosophy, and the sciences. And today we're going to be doing something very similar, Your Holiness, but in the context of Advaita Vedanta, one of the great traditions, the great spiritual and contemplative traditions of India. In some ways, Your Holiness, we might be picking up on this notion that Dan Goleman mentioned of a community of practice. In order for a research agenda to move forward, there needs to be a community, a set of interlocutors engaged in a conversation who richly inform each other's understanding of that research agenda. And that conversation, in our case, needs to go across two different ways of approaching reality, two different ways of understanding the human mind and the human body, and that's contemplative traditions and scientific traditions. So we'll be attempting to perhaps build a little bit of that community of practice once again today in the context of Advaita Vedanta. Your Holiness, I think you already know almost everyone on the panel here, but just to briefly remind everyone, allow me to introduce our panelists. We have Dr. Wolf Singer, of course, once again. He's the director of the Max Planck Institute in Frankfurt. And as he said to me this morning, he's kind of, these days, an itinerant neuroscientist wandering about Asia, recently in Thailand, working on a book with Matthew Ricard. To my right is Chakravarti Ramprasad, professor of comparative religion and philosophy at the University of Lancaster in the United Kingdom. Ram will be one of our main presenters today. To my left is Swami Atmapriyananda, who is the Vice Chancellor of the Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda University, and Your Holiness, he will be our other presenter today. At the end is Mathieu Ricard, well known to you, our monk, philosopher, scientist, photographer, and so on and so forth. And then finally, I'd like to introduce a panelist that you have not yet met today, and that is Dr. Aditya Murthy. Dr. Murthy is Associate Professor at the Center for Neuroscience in the Indian Institute of Science at Bangalore. His research, Your Holiness, deals a lot with actually with vision, and also the relationship between vision and action, what we call sensory-motor coupling. And in particular, this involves decision-making. So his research spans vision, decision-making, and action based upon vision. And this is, of course, a very interesting topic that I think relates closely to a number of issues in contemplative practice, including behavior change. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to our first panelist, if I might. Swamiji, yesterday we spoke quite a lot about maybe perhaps more theoretical issues, some philosophical issues. And today I hope that you will enlighten us about the nature of Advaita practice. For example, if I were an Advaita practitioner about to sit on the cushion or adopt whatever posture I adopt for formal practice, what kinds of things would I do? So Swamiji, please enlighten us.
With my respectful salutations to His Holiness and all the venerable monks present here, and greetings to all the eager participants. The difficulty with Advaita Vedanta is that it tells you not to do anything first. There's an interesting story in Swami Vivekananda's life. An American aspirant came to him, excited. Swamiji, what are we to do? Vivekananda said nothing. But he added after a pause, if you can't really do it, do some good to society. So the most difficult thing to do is to do nothing. Advaita Vedanta says that it is not you sit somewhere and think about something, because if you think about something, you do dhyana, meditation in the English language. Advaita Vedanta talks about jnana rather than dhyana. Jnana is knowledge, dhyana is thinking or bhavana. Shankaracharya, the Acharya of the Advaita Vedanta tradition, he makes a very interesting distinction. He says you see things as they are, or you imagine something to be something else, and through that imagination, you arrive at the truth. The first he calls in Sanskrit, Vastu Tantra. Vastu means a thing as it is. Tantra means a technique. Seeing a thing as it is. The other is Purusha Tantra. A person can manipulate the thing seen according to his choice, his imagination. An example is given. You see the tree. Yes, I see the tree. See the tree as a dog. Can you see the tree? Tree is a tree. You can't see it in anything else. But you can imagine a picture, a statue, an idol, and then think that it is the Lord himself present there. The God is present there in that idol. That is the Purusha Tantra, in which the person who is looking at it manipulates his vision according to what he wants to arrive at. Shankaracharya is very emphatic that the Advaita Vedanta is based on Vastu Tantra, seeing a thing as it is, what the Buddhist parlance, Yatha Bhuta Darshana, just see a thing as it is without imagining it to be something as you would like it to be. This is the fundamental difficulty in practice of Advaita. In a sense, the ultra-Advaitists would say that Advaita just has no practice. You begin and you end. The first step is, in a sense, the last step. That is for very advanced aspirants. Some qualifications are prescribed. The qualifications are, many of them are prescribed. Two of the most important preliminary qualifications that you need before you enter into the practice is intense longing to arrive at truth. You're so much seized of the urge to get at truth as it is that you can't rest unless you arrive at truth. The example given is, suppose your hair is on fire and somebody tells you, I have a beautiful a cup of coffee waiting for you. Why don't you finish that and then go? You wouldn't just wait. Just like your hair is on fire, you would rush to put out that fire. You are so much seized of it. See, Ramakrishna gives a wonderful example. A guru was going for a bath with a disciple. The disciple asked him, what kind of intense longing do I need to be able to arrive at this truth? The guru said, come with me for a bath. Both of them were taking a bath in the rivers. When the disciple was taking a bath, the guru simply pressed his head below the waters, wouldn't let it go. The disciple was simply gasping for a breath and said, what are they doing to me? Please leave me alone. When he got out of it, how did you feel? Feeling I was just panting for a breath of air. If you can have this kind of intense longing for truth, then you'll arrive at truth. Instantly. This is one example which is given. And the other is the ability to be able to give up, sacrifice anything for the sake of truth. I want truth, nothing but truth, anything which will stop me. Anything which stops me as an impediment in the way of truth, I will sacrifice it. See Ramakrishna's life. He was so much devoted to Mother Kali, the Divine Mother, who he saw, talked to as a reality. When his teacher, Advaitic teacher, pushed him to Advaita, he said, I can go up to a point where my mother is a reality. She is talking to me, living goddess. I can't go beyond it. Totapuri pushed him into it. You have to sacrifice even that form to be able to go beyond. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, I imagined knowledge as a sword, cut the form of the mother into two, and my mind went to the Advaita. So truth is vitally important. You wouldn't stop before that. As we discussed yesterday, the ultimate truth can't be described in words, although it can be realized by a pure mind. Then the human mind is eager to get some kind of an approximation to truth. Can you approximately define the ultimate, if not exactly? Then they have a way of describing this. The Advaitins say, you go on generalizing. We discussed from the particular to the general, general to the more general, and the most general and the universal. All of us exist. I exist, you exist, the dog exists, the tree exists, everything exists. Rather than saying, this exists and that exists, you take existence separately and bracket all this and that in a bracket. So you isolate existence as a pure existence apart from something existing, and that is a universal existence where everybody shares. And this existence doesn't need any person to reveal itself. Suppose you want to reveal this chair, if the room is entirely dark, you bring a light or a torch and to reveal it. But who reveals this existence? If somebody has to reveal this existence, then something else is required to reveal that existence and so on. You come to what is known as infinite regress or anavastha. And therefore, this existence, pure existence, has to be and this existence has to be self-revealing, therefore. So it is a self-revealing, pure being or existence. And awareness of this existence leads you to ananda or bliss. An approximate description of this ultimate reality, therefore, is Sat, existence, pure being, Chit, self-revealing awareness or consciousness, and Ananda, or pure bliss. In a very simple way in daily life, you can see, none of us wants to die. I want to live on, live on. That is because my nature is existence. Everybody wants to know more and more and more because my nature is knowledge. Everybody wants to be happy all the time because my nature is happiness. Now, certain practices are given. The practices, first think of yourself as luminous existence. Luminosity meaning the self-revealing luminosity which does not require any other light to reveal it. So always identify yourself with Satchidananda Swarupa, the nature of pure existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute, and think of yourself as luminous. And to be able to think of yourself as luminous, with all the limitations which you have to go through a number of purifications step by step by step. A large number of purificatory steps are mentioned. First you start with the external and say, may I be purified in the external elements, earth, water, fire, air, space. I am the luminous self, blemishless, taintless, sinless. There are very powerful Upanishadic mantras where you can do this. Purify the inner organs of perception. I am the luminous self, pure, and purify the body, mind, and speech, the innermost subtle organs, and the unmanifested ahankara, or the egoism at the last step, and the 5 layers which we mentioned yesterday, the annamaya, pranamaya, manomaya, vijnanamaya, anandamaya, the physical, the vital, the mental, the intellectual, and the blissful, the sheaths which cover the luminous self, and all the desires and cravings which I have, I completely purge all of them, and having been purged of all this, I remain as the supreme light of consciousness and offer myself as an oblation into the infinite fire of the Brahman. So this is a very interesting, detailed purification where you identify yourself as the Supreme Self. And when you sit in the cushion, as was mentioned by the moderator, what do? Identify yourself as the luminous self. Remember and imagine that you are beyond this body and mind. If some of the non-believers and hardcore atheists and agnostics say, it's only an imagination. Is it true? There are only hypnotizing yourself into believing this. Swami Vivekananda was challenged this way, and he made a very interesting retort. He said, it is not hypnotization. You are already hypnotized into believing that you are little body and little self. All that I am doing is I am dehypnotizing you by making you remember your real nature. So Vedanta, in a sense, it is a process of dehypnotizing yourself. Think of yourself sitting in the cushion, in an AC room perhaps, and imagine that you are a fish, a luminous fish, swimming in an infinite luminous ocean of Satchidananda. Happily, you can see how fish move around very happily, much happier than we are. And imagine that you are a bird flying in the infinite akasha, sky of Satchidananda. They call it Chidakasha, the sky of consciousness. And you can also imagine that you are infinitely expansive and expand the whole universe. And in this process, you dehypnotize yourself by saying that I am not the little self, I am one with all. So the step by step you go ahead, and one other practice is mentioned. You withdraw all the senses from the outside world and merge them in the mind. Merge the mind in the buddhi or the intellect. Merge the intellect in the cosmic intelligence, and that in the Supreme Self. Another technique which has been very popularized in the recent times by a great saint in the southern India called Ramana Maharshi, he said, when each thought arises in the mind, take hold of the thought and ask it, where do you come from? The thought will say, I come from such and such a source. Can you take me back to the source? Take help of the thought and go back to the source. So when each thought can be caught hold of, it's not so easy, but you go back to the source of thought and merge in that Atman from which the thought arises. So every thought has to be questioned as to where you come from. It will say, I. Which is the I? Who am I? Constantly questioned. Called Atma Vichara. Another practice which is given is, rather than eliminate the external world, why can't think of the external world the extension of the same Atman? This is a positive kind of practice, because every experience that you have is in and is through the Atman or the self. If the self were not there, if consciousness were not there, you wouldn't be seeing or perceiving anything. So rather than concentrating on the forms and names which you see, remember that the background, the adhisthana, the background, the ground of the reality is that supreme consciousness, and use this as a message to go to the source of the Atman. When there is a sound which is disturbing you, you can think of that as an SMS from the consciousness. You have an SMS from consciousness, oh, he is calling you, and then go back to the source. This is one practice which is given. And Kathopanishad gives a very interesting imagery. Think of this body as a chariot. In those days we had horse carriages. Think of the body as a chariot, which has 9 doors, Navadvara. The Atman is sitting there as the charioteer, and the Buddhi is the master of the chariot. The Buddhi is the chariot, the driver, and the reins which they have is the manas or the mind, and the various indriyas are the horses. If the horses are bad horses, if the horses are turbulent, untrained, they will take the chariot and then you'll have to crash. If the horses are good, they lead you along the right path. So I'll just end by a very interesting story from Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. What happens to you because of this? What kind of changes come to your character, and what kind of changes you can bring outside? The first change which happens is you have sameness, same Atman pervading everywhere, and you treat everybody as your own self. This is a great statement in the Gita. Atmaupamyena sarvatra samam pashyati Arjuna sukham va idiva dukkham sa yogi paramo mata. You share the joys and sorrows of others as if it is your very own. Then what happens is, when the I vanishes, you get equanimity, compassion, calmness, forgiveness, and infinite friendliness. You are happy in everybody's company. When I see His Holiness all the time, I always feel He is identified with everybody. And you don't feel awed by Him. I never used to feel awed by Him because you feel so close, He is your very own. That feeling comes to you just by His very presence because He is identifying with the entire universe, sending waves of love, waves of compassion, in that everybody is engulfed, as it were. This is a feeling which naturally comes to you, and the sense of vastness which you have makes you absolutely unperturbed in all situations. The stress which we were talking about yesterday. Vivekananda gives an interesting story. A mosquito was sitting in the horn of a bull. You know, the bull is a huge fellow and huge horns. A mosquito was sitting and biting for a long time. It got tired and said, "Mr. Bull, I'm going to leave you now. I have troubled you enough." The bull saw the mosquito and said, "Oh, I never noticed you. You come on with your entire family and settle down on my horn for whole life. What can you do to me? I am that infinite self. I am the infinite ocean. All kinds of miseries and joys and sorrows will come and go. I am absolutely unperturbed." Vivekananda said, "Clouds of happiness and misery pass over me. I am that infinite blue sky." And it is good to remember that the infinite self of the Atman of the goal is not to be confused with the little ego. The ego, the anatta, which Buddha has talked about, he was talking about the non-existence of the little ego, and Vedanta talks about the same reality when it vanishes as the infinite self. Sri Ramakrishna gives two pen pictures with which I'll stop, because it is so useful, wonderful pen pictures. He said, an ant went to a sugar hill. Ant was very greedy. It took a small grain of sugar. Its stomach was full. It took another grain in the mouth. It couldn't carry any more. When it was walking away, it looked at the hill and said, "Next time I'll carry the entire hill to my hole." The little ego, little human mind thinks it can encompass and gobble up the infinite, which it can't. All that it can do simply collapse and surrender. And he also says, a salt doll went to measure the depth of the ocean. Who will come and report to you what happened? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Swamiji. There may be some temptation to just rest in those blissful waves of compassion right now, but we should move on. Before we move on to our next presenter, I'd just like to ask His Holiness if you have any comments or questions that you'd like to address to Swamiji. We'll have a more extended discussion after Ram's talk, but if you have any comments right now.
In the form of blessings.
Is it on? Soon, combination. On the shot.
Right.
No.
By the way,
Yeah.
No.
I usually describe Hinduism and Buddhism as like twin brothers. And logically, before Buddha come, already the quite sophisticated spirituality already exists here. So Buddhism, I think, accepts some special things. Otherwise, you see, the sort of more or less is the same sort of
Same.
structure. So,
For example, one of the key ideas that comes through in the presentation is the idea of calming and of the conceptual elaborations.
So, broadly speaking, almost same. But if you go very detailed, well, there must be differences. I believe, like Nagarjuna or the Dharmakirti and also Chandrakirti and Vavaveka, I think they also, study very, very thoroughly about non-Buddhist
Traditions.
Concept. So you see, they put a lot of sort of argument. I think these argument, after they thoroughly study about these sort of the traditions, then they found there are some differences. Broadly speaking, very same, very similar. So like truly, like brothers, spiritual brothers, sisters, like that. So wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you very much, Your Holiness.
Yes.
So perhaps we will move on. We're having a little trouble with your mic. So perhaps while Ram is moving on to his presentation, we will, Diego, perhaps while Ram is doing his presentation, we can actually remove His Holiness's mic and work on that, please. Thank you. Why don't we just actually take the mic and make it work? Thank you. So, now I'd like to ask Chakravarti Ram Prasad to make his presentation. And part of the aim of this session, again, is to integrate the contemplative tradition with the scientific traditions. And that's going to be one of the goals of Ram's talk here. So without further ado, Ram.
Well, is that working now?
I think you're on.
Okay. Your Holiness, respected elders, brothers and sisters, after the very stirring exposition you've heard, I'm afraid you're going to find what I have to say rather dry and boring, but that's my job. Especially in the context of what Your Holiness has said about the sibling relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism. What I want to do is to explore the degree of overlap, similarity, and difference, just as it exists between siblings. In the context of extending contemplative science from Buddhism to Advaita, given that so much of the excellent research that's been done so far has been on Buddhist contemplation, the similarities and differences present us with an interesting challenge. Can we use the similarities and differences about consciousness and its transformation in ways that are detectable in the brain and therefore can be studied? So throughout this talk, I want to look at the extent to which there is scientific traction in the comparative study of Advaita and Buddhism. So let me look quickly at some of these similarities and differences. Now, in common with Buddhist views, Advaita argues that the sense of a distinct and individual self set apart from all other locations of consciousness is fundamentally an illusion. So the individual, who's picked out by the use of the I, is constituted in life through the body, through psychology, through social relationships. But there is no independent and unique entity different from all other entities. Advaita calls this I, or aham, an I formation, an ahankara, the making up of an I. Sometimes this is called ego in translation, and I have used it myself. But we should be careful to distinguish such usage from the one in psychology. In psychology, the ego is the practical sense of self, the lack of which has bad consequences for human beings. An individual without ego is open to manipulation or to exploitation. So in order to set that aside, let me continue to talk about the I or the I formation, even though that's a little bit more clumsy than ego. Now, the Buddhist would agree with the Advaitin to this extent, that this individuated sense of self is an illusion and must be understood. However, as Your Holiness pointed out in your introductory words yesterday, the Buddhist would hold that position to be that of anatmavada, would say that what is denied, therefore, is the Atman. Now, the Advaitin would say that while Atman is indeed not this individual self, they nevertheless hold Atmavada, theory of Atman, because by Atman they mean something rather different. They say that it refers to the very nature of consciousness itself, the presence found in and required by every and all awareness, not just the awareness of particular objects. This Advaitic Atman is the generic name, the very general name for all consciousness. That is why the Advaitins can say, like Sureshwara, who's a famous disciple of Shankara, that even insects have Atman. So a self is not an entity that has consciousness, as is held by most other Hindu schools for Advaita, but rather it's consciousness itself. Seen in this way, the critical difference between Advaita and many strands of Mahayana Buddhism, especially the synthetic Yogacara Madhyamika school, which has so much impact in Tibet, the difference is at one and the same time, small and major, because it concerns not consciousness itself, but how it is understood. Now, consciousness for the Advaitin is continuous. It persists smoothly at all times. So the two words that the Advaitins use in translation is, it is eternal and singular. For Yogacara Madhyamika, consciousness is infinitely granular. It changes from one minimal instant to the next. That is why it's called momentariness. Philosophically, this is taken to be a fundamental difference between the eternal and the momentary. Of course, Advaita allows for changes in our normal states of awareness, and Yogacara Madhyamika allows for continuities. But those explanations are secondary. This is the fundamental difference. And it is supposed to have the greatest implication for the understanding of reality, for an ultimate explanation of things are. But it is very difficult to see how or even whether this translates into a scientifically sustainable distinction, especially as our understanding in physics gets more sophisticated. The very meaning of persistence and momentariness looks less and less stable. Now, it can be argued that the difference over whether consciousness is unified into a single continuum, as Advaita holds, or it is constituted by the interdependence of closely connected instantaneous points of consciousness, as in Yogacara Madhyamika, it's really about phenomenology rather than physics. It's really about, it is how it is experienced rather than how it can be analyzed externally. If this is a matter then of how our psychology functions, then perhaps neuroscience may indeed get some traction on the problem. I'm being very speculative here. For example, if gamma oscillations do indeed correlate with self-awareness, we could perhaps look at their microstructures and interpret our findings and check whether they more naturally are interpretable through the idea of continuity or through punctuation. Another way of exploring the differences between Yogacara Madhyamika and Advaita might be through looking at the area of memory, which is a very well-developed area, of course. So explicit memory, for example, looking at pathways subject to long-term potentiation, may be better explained by a cognitive model that treats consciousness as continuous, or it might perhaps be better explained if it is seen as punctuated into extremely small time periods. Now that is important because Advaita uses memory and the continuity because Advaita uses the philosophical argument from memory and the continuities of memory in support of its notion of the unity of consciousness, this might be a place where the philosophical discussions of long ago have some kind of traction in contemporary research. Now, let me hasten to add that the main objective of such differentiation that I'm suggesting cannot in any crude way be a way of adjudicating and saying this is right, this is wrong. That seems both conceptually unlikely and ethically unwise. This is particularly the case because if, in fact, psychological states are what some philosophers call multiply realizable, then what it means is the same psychological state could be, so the same psychological state could be realized at different neurobiological levels through, in different ways, even with different individuals of the same species. In fact, it could even be argued that the same technique with the same viewpoint may be realized differently even in the same person at different times. So if states are multiply realizable, then you cannot make a once and for all distinction between whether one kind of explanation works and another doesn't. So we should use comparisons primarily to explore the range of ways in which the brain registers contemplation and its consequences. Having said that, it seems to me that what is most likely to be scientifically tractable in Advaita is in fact to do with practices where it is very close to or similar to those in Buddhism. Now let me look at some of these areas. So first of all, Swamiji has already mentioned this, there is the Advaitic commitment to the attainment of an awareness that is free of the limitations of I formation. Now this presents the same challenges as Buddhist contemplative objectives to the realization of an Atman. Given that egocentric representation, that is, the structuring of time, space, and objects through the perspective of a particular limited subject, is really basic to ordinary human life. How could we study what seems to be the requirement to expand consciousness beyond its individual boundaries and contracting the sense of I to vanishing point? If that simultaneity of doing away with the sense of the limited I and of expanding consciousness so that there aren't distinctions is the requirement of the ultimate requirement of contemplative techniques, then how does it fit with what seem to be fairly robust models of how humans in fact function? Here I think the pioneering work of Richard Davidson and others on open presence and related modes of contemplative awareness may point to the way for a sober study of this apparently counterintuitive way of seeking spiritual transformation. Second, and again, Swamiji has already mentioned this, second is Advaita takes the ultimate state of realization as ananda, or happiness. The relationship between this supreme happiness and ordinary happiness is very complex in Advaita. On the one hand, Advaitins warn against such ordinary happiness as comes through attachment and desire. On the other hand, they also take such ordinary happiness as an indicative model that, in fact, the supreme human goal is happiness. In this, they are remarkably similar to Your Holiness's own refocusing of Buddhist teaching on spiritual happiness. So this is certainly an area for fruitful comparison of contemplative techniques, as well as the philosophical concepts that inform them, as we have seen in the last decade, pioneering work on the relationship between happiness and contemplation. A third area that concerns the very interesting Advaitic use of deep sleep as a phenomenological model for samadhi, or a state of perfectly de-individuated consciousness. So the Advaitins say that the normally accessible notion of sleep, deep sleep, sushupti, in which there is a suspension of the suspension of our normal stresses and anxieties, indicates that in fact there is a state of being in which there is that perfect balance, because when we wake up we are aware of the fact we have slept well. Now, the philosophical justification for the presence of consciousness in deep sleep requires a great deal more work. But because, as Richie indicated yesterday, there is already work afoot on the connection between sleep and meditative states. So the inclusion of Advaitic practitioners in this might be a way of expanding this area. Fourth is the overall Advaitic model of the ideal practitioner. For Advaita, as we know, there are three stages to spiritual inquiry: Shravana, or listening to teachings; Manana, or the analytic thinking of Advaitic teachings; and Nididhyasana, or contemplation. Here, Shravana seems to pertain very much to attention, and therefore slots into the increasing research on changes to attention brought about through increased practice. There's also the interesting point that the Advaitins give the analogy of listening to music. We all understand that there will be a difference between a passerby hearing a raga and receiving it simply as sound falling on his ears, and a trained and practiced musician who will appreciate, who will have a cognitive response which is fundamentally different. They liken that to the difference between an ordinary person listening to the teachings in the Upanishads and a trained practitioner who is receptive to its potential capacities. The second manana, or the analytic grasp of teachings, is interesting because it suggests that intellectual activity is itself part of deepening contemplative achievement. Again, this appears tractable to study, as it looks likely that the brain signatures of thoughts with similar linguistic content, aham brahmasmi, I am Brahman, will be different at different stages of spiritual engagement with that idea. Finally, with nididhyasana, we see a wide variety of ways of focusing on the Advaitic understanding of Atman, those which have been so interestingly brought to life in Swamiji's lecture. I just at this point want to say something about the historical context that should be kept in mind. Advaita has perhaps seen greater historical rupture than the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. The integration of techniques from classical yoga, for example, which was seen in 10th or 11th century Advaitic texts, did not continue smoothly over the centuries. So it's only through the creative rereading of Advaita by Swami Vivekananda, Ramana Maharishi, and even more recent teachers that we find Advaitic contemplation as a living tradition today. So for this reason, more conceptual groundwork has to be done to find connections between the classical texts in which we find the ideas and contemporary practice, so that if neuroscientific study of Advaitic contemplation is going to be grounded in the Advaitic concepts, excuse me, more work needs to be done. I want to end with probably what is the greatest challenge to neuroscientific contemplative science. And it is one where Advaita and Indo-Tibetan Buddhism have had great philosophical debates between them, but where at some fundamental level they converge. This is the issue of luminosity, or the view that there can be a realization, a phenomenal state, entirely free of intentionality or relationship to objects, and free of the constraints of the body, even while the consciousness is present in the body. Your Holiness has, of course, taught that this can be attained, and Ramana did too. At present, there seems no way for this to be amenable to the techniques of neuroscience, even neuroscientific approach that is not committed to physicalism, as I explained yesterday. But given the point that was made about the rapid advances of neuroscience over the past 50 years since its birth, perhaps the next generation of young scientists, especially those amongst you, will find a way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram. Thank you very much, Ram. There's so much rich potential for conversation, Your Holiness, between both Swamiji's presentation and Ram's presentation, and I'm guessing that our panelists will have much to report on. Some similarities with the style of Buddhist practice that Mathieu Ricard is especially familiar with. The questions about how some of these practices and claims about the nature of consciousness might be examined scientifically. I think that's some of what we might talk about now, and we have a good hour for conversation. But first, Your Holiness, I'd like to turn to you and see if you have any comments or questions or debates you'd like to raise with Ram's presentation.
Really, while I'm listening, those presentations, remarkable. But meantime, I felt, I think, trouble we are facing. Nearly 7 billion human beings facing. Usually I describe, usually I believe I think many problems which we are facing is our own creation. That ultimately related with our views or our attitude. So here, like compassion, I think everybody experience affection. So not necessary to complicated philosophy. And then patience, tolerance, the holistic view. So that I think we can promote. One way, I think our sort of conference, main aim is promoting certain our mental attitude which really makes differences on this planet. So this problem which we are facing is not due to lack of understanding about these very subtle phenomena. So it doesn't matter. That's the individual practitioner's business. That's my view. And then, of course, another kind of sort of meeting. What is this? Very deep, sort of sophisticated sort of philosophy or teaching. What is their similarities? What their similarities? What's the differences? Then these sort of talks, I think, very good. That's my view. Of course, meantime, I don't know how to discuss it about these very, very subtle thing. And clear light, or Kazada says that.
Clear light, yeah, luminosity.
These are, of course, interesting, but I don't think it's much directly relevant to today's world problem. I don't think. That's my view. Of course, wonderful. This is your presentation and your presentation. Oh, wonderful. That's my view, my comment. And some questions?
Yes, do we have a comment or reaction to that? Anyone?
Well, I felt a little bit similar because I suddenly realized, especially Swamiji from your presentation and also from the many discussions I had with Matthew, that there is not just this sitting and concentrating and doing nothing, but that there is a lot of intellectual effort, of reasoning, of thinking, so that the whole process to me becomes, in a sense, less mystical than I thought in the very beginning. It is a process of learning, of cultivation, which I think everybody experiences throughout life. Maybe less intensive, less well-framed. But I think we all go through this process of transformation by gathering experience, by listening to advice and people who talk to us without being in a meditative state, just by trying to realize what this other one thinks. And then, of course, it is ultimately helpful to concentrate, be alone, be able to support this being alone in order to understand and have the time to really let things sink. So maybe many of the processes that occur and that produce a transformation are processes that everybody experiences in his life, although it is less thematized, less focused, less made important. So this is why I noted down that another approach to the scientific penetration of these practices is, of course, psychology. Not only neuroscience. I feel very humble as a neuroscientist in the moment, because I don't think we have the techniques available to differentiate between the various stages of a deconstructed ego. This is so subtle, this is so far away from what we understand in the moment, since we don't even understand simplest perceptual processes in the brain, that we could perhaps dissect what happens in these meditative practices using the terminology and the taxonomy that we have already in psychology. And so I could imagine that cognitive psychologists interacting intensively with practitioners could find elements in there which they know, which have been experimented in the laboratory, recreated situations of learning, of concentration, attentional mechanisms and all those things. So maybe if one dissects it into the various components it has, it becomes first less mystical and then more approachable, first through psychology, and once this is clear, we have a well-defined phenomena that then one can try to treat with neurophysiological techniques, because that's what we do in the moment. We take what the psychologists found out as an object of our research. So maybe we need this additional interface. Maybe it's a tour de force a little bit too brutal if we take a meditator directly into the lab. That will allow us to differentiate states. And there was another thing that came to my mind is there's much talking about altered states of consciousness. Now, there's a whole science out there on the analysis of altered states of consciousness. And part of it is serious. There are serious studies on the change in volition when you are in hypnotic states or autosuggestive states. Because there seems to be an element of autosuggestion also here, especially in the mandala-based meditation. So, yeah, let's see the components of these processes, and maybe there's more known already than we think if we take a more sober approach. And then just a comment in brackets that occurred to me, that this deconstruction of the self and the attempt to get rid of suffering. When I heard you talk and when I heard you talk about getting this self gone, and after I had heard the talk of Dan Coleman last night, so this put something together. Maybe what it's all about is to break down the boundaries between in-group and out-group. Because it appears as men would, within the in-group, in the family, be mainly good. You are caring, you are empathic, you are altruistic. You only get very bad in competition with out-groups. Now, if you succeed in breaking down this boundary through these methods, then everything becomes the in-group. And then that's where you want to be. Mm-hmm. So, thank you.
I have one question. The different level of consciousness, that mainly is mentioned in tantric practice. So the grosser level of mind, which is the absorb, dissolve, more subtler. Then, firstly, the breathing eventually stop. Outwardly looks unconscious, but the practitioner then experiencing deeper consciousness. So you see, konga tagi ta gase sungdo. Deep and nyamnyong to do no to check.
So the question to you, Swamiji, is that you I don't know if this is on. Yeah. The question to you, Swamiji, is that you refer to the experience of this chit, which has this quality of ananda and luminosity as its nature. So, from your understanding, when a practitioner experiences that state, very deep consciousness, would you say that the breathing respiration process ceases?
They say the respiration ceases, and in the heart you experience a kind of luminosity which the Christian mystics have called the uncreated light. And in the Antar-Jyoti is the word which is used in the Upanishads. And some people have experienced that this changes very soon into an uncreated sound, which is called the Anahata Dhvani, which is not struck, which doesn't emanate from any striking of two objects. And therefore it is eternally existent, and the light and the sound coexist, and you get an insight into the origin of the entire thing from light and sound. And this light, they say, is the light of consciousness. For the first time you realize yourself as pure consciousness apart from the body and the mind. They call the Jivatman, or the localized consciousness. Thereafter it expands into the universal consciousness in which everybody is encompassed.
가서 시베런식 다 살베.
네, 시베런.
그거. 제가 나도 남괴 중 나라데 다 천시 시바 샤인즈잖아요. 다 시리 야로 협스도가.
다이나 구조대 시바.
다들 가서 되고 가서 그래. 왜 기지기지 요도 돼야 다들 시거든. 다 덕지 랑 다 디시 말마다 시베더니 다 시행도. 너무 좀
His Holiness is wondering, because even in the Buddhist tradition, although the Atma is
some school of thought,
although the Atma is rejected universally in the Buddhist world, but there is some identification of what the person is. And some Buddhist schools have chosen
the person soul, the person
the being, who the being is. And in some Buddhist schools have chosen to identify that with consciousness. So the nature of being is consciousness. So which seems to be similar. So this seems to be, in fact, in some ways, kind of resonance that shows similarity with the kind of Samkhya notion of self as awareness. Of course, as Buddhist schools, even these schools would not identify that being to be eternal and independent.
And kunshi ngor changes in the kare chilol kare chik kare tiko chik yor dange yaw sin chemun ma da chik kore nyongzamro chik ma da chilo chik sukro so de che de kare chik she
ya lare kol chage
mo kore ngor de lu mo de chik she de ko da she.
So there is also a notion of alaya vijnana in store consciousness or foundational consciousness in Yogacara, some segment of Yogacara, which again identifies the primary consciousness, this alaya, to be neutral and not taking on any external objects by itself.
Then another I want just this is almost not a private conversation of Shichaldoa. It almost looks like a
private conversation.
It's okay.
Private conversation in public.
You don't mind if we have a private conversation up here for a while, do you?
So it's just I want to know among Tibetan practitioners, number of cases after death, the body remains very fresh. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, like that. It actually happened. So this year also, I think 2 or 3 cases happened. So we have, so therefore, you see, in recent years, you see, any record, you see, person who after die, body still remain fresh till certain
for a
Or
long,
is it next
for a long
1
time.
week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, like that? Some cases 4 weeks. So any record?
Recent times I've not seen any records of such.
So our explanation is the grosser level of mind, as long as the heart, the beating stop, then circulation of blood in brain cease. So then clinically dead. So the brain work stop, the all grosser level of mind, which depend on brain cell, then no longer function. So more subtler consciousness still there. So body still not decaying. So it's actually that's the happening. So this to scientists, see, I think you may not know. In one occasion, in many years ago, see, we discussed or we mentioned about that subject has come. I think you may know, and the Riji knows. So then, some scientists showing interest. So they eventually put one equipment to test, to examine the dead body, still very fresh. So some period, when that mission there, nobody died, nobody happened that. And one occasion, a few occasions that occur, mission not available. So then eventually, see that one occasion, one person who, after he died, about 4 or 5 days, after five days, I got the information, his body remained fresh. Then I asked the concerned people, then there's some people went there and put this wire. So next about, I think 18 days or something, they remain like that. So recent, in South India, at least as far as I know, 3 persons that happened. I think 10 days, around 10 days, or one, I think 14 days or something. Then somehow,
But somehow we were not able to test them. Yeah.
In recent times,
so actually, you see, we are, some sort of preparation to examine these cases. So I'm hoping now more people to die. then we have the opportunity to examine more often.
Inconvenient that they haven't died at the right time.
Oh.
there are two records of not recent times. One is Ramakrishna Paramahamsa's own case.
Oh.
The other is Ramana Maharshi, who died very recently, of Samadhi.
Oh.
Ramakrishna was put into Samadhi by his guru Totapuri, the Advaitic teacher. It is recorded that he went into Samadhi within 3 days and remained in it for 6 months. Clinically, he was supposed to have been totally dead. The heart functioning stopped and the lungs stopped. There was no breath.
Yes, that's right.
No breath, nothing. Absolute. Some doctors went and examined in those days, whatever instruments they had.
Yes.
And they said, science will declare you to be totally dead.
Yes.
6 months he was in that state, and again he came back from that state. It is recorded.
Oh.
And in Ramana Maharshi's case, so many people, the children and the other boys in South India, they were troubling him, so he jumped into a well, which is abandoned. Remained in that state of Samadhi, this record about 9-10 months. And then somebody picked him up from there, and then worms have eaten up, and then scorpions were over his body, and half of his flesh was already eaten up by the white ants. So he was taken up and treated and came back. So there is an interesting story. When Ramakrishna went to one of his villages nearby his hometown, the story went around that here is a man who died 6 times in a day and came back alive 6 times in a day. So crowds of people started following him.
Great. that's the jibe shine dang, the shine zame peji mare. And the assess that the Kanzam is legal. That Tuni Tawa the Demato, Shen Solutilin Mudibuli. Chazangata, Nume lo Peji, Monticun Combiad in the Peji, Korea Chumbina, and what a Shishbo to cook up in the war, or a Sunbeam or things in the Dajin Dawa lot and the Gabagava on the Sajora. Did the Barisha.
So this is a wonderful example that you gave
And
because
Swami Vivekananda, in the West, it seems he subjected himself to being tested. But the instruments were not available. The record is that he went into Samadhi, and the doctors examined him and said, science has no answer to this.
Yes.
You are dead.
Right, that's right.
So it's also saying that it's wonderful that you gave these two examples because what this shows is that an advanced yogi can actually willfully enter into these states and evoke these states and then actually come back. So in the Buddhist texts also, the understanding is that as through the practice of flowing, controlling the flow of energy inside the nadis, you can progressively bring the level of consciousness to a very deepened state, and at some point you can remain in this samadhi for a long time and actually come back as well. So that idea is there. Even
Many yogis have claimed they can stop the breath and then release it.
Yes, that's right.
I wanted to see, yes, Wolf, yes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think we came to a very, very serious point of our discussions here. Because also last night when I was talking to practitioners, I heard reports of yogis who don't eat and don't drink for weeks, but are fine, warm, run around. This is not compatible with what science is assuming. It violates the conservation of energy laws. It violates virtually everything that we know of. So the only conclusion is that our science falls short of very essential things that seem to be observable, which is a big problem, because for us it means we have theories that cannot account for essential, and these are really essential phenomena. I mean, but if it were just little noise effects, one wouldn't worry. But this is really shaking the basis of our science fundamentals. And I think we cannot comment on it because we have no handle to deal with it in the moment. There's, I think, within the Western scientific system, since the Enlightenment, neither physics nor chemistry nor neurobiology nor any other discipline can say anything about it. And this is a conundrum that I think is really, it may be that we are in a stage of phase transition, that the science has closed the eyes in front of these phenomena for most of the time, and that something will happen like it happened when classical physics was transformed into quantum physics. There were a few little tiny effects that were not explainable in the classical system, and that got the whole thing going. So maybe we have again a situation where a few little observations that are not very frequent, that seem to be also confined to certain cultures, which is very curious, that we don't observe these things very much in the West, at least I haven't had any reports, that these disturbances in a seemingly solid building of explanations or system of explanations will cause a phase transition.
So the other day, as I mentioned, the West, I mean, science come from West. So mainly, up to now, they examine external things. So I think not adequate pay attention about our consciousness or mind or these things. So whereas in India, 1,000 years, it's the practice of samadhi, that means concentration. So, more sort of what's the explanation? Really is all with that.
So we find much more rich presentation and understanding of the complex world of mental states.
And also there are cases who,
Demonstrate.
Some sort of extraordinary sort of experiences through practice of training of mind and some deep samadhi. These things. So it is quite useful. You see, now more research work, and then, as the other days I mentioned, then modern science really become complete. External things, about knowledge about external things, knowledge about internal things. As an academic level also is very good. And then through that way, also you see, I think public can educate the importance of how much sort of the important factor about our mental attitude.
Mental attitude.
So these things like that. So I think yesterday also, I mentioned, you see, we need close sort of the coordination. Some cases, you see, now for example, you see some person who really deep samadhi, and even if a few weeks remain dead, wonderful. Not necessarily 6 months. Few weeks. And then also, you mentioned, you see, practice, there's a certain sort of practice, they only water or some other, there are different sort of practice, different tradition. But some cases with water, just water, some cases with fresh air, you see, remain 3 weeks or at the beginning of training. Then eventually, a few months, you can remain. If you find some the normal meal, take. But without normal meal, you can remain several months. So that also there. Now one quite sort of a nice story. I know one monk. Now he already passed away. At Dharamsala, once he tried to sort of practice that. So,
Chulen. It's called Chulen practice. Literally means extracting the essence.
So he, beginning, supposed to be 3 weeks, have to remain without solid meal. Then he told me, I think about 4 or 5 days, about a week, he remained. He tried. He can follow that.
He was able to do it.
Discipline, right?
Discipline.
Then after a week, he's so hungry. Then you see some sort of offering things there. Torma.
Torma.
He he told me that. So he failed.
Well, that may not be the best practice to study scientifically normal eating.
But there's some, I know, you see, in Tibet, some people, because that practice already,
advanced,
experienced. So, some cases in Chinese Gulag, very poor sort of meal, and they remain sort of no damage on their body. Practice this. So several months or few years, it happened like that.
Well, I think, Your Holiness, as Wolf said...
Then another, I think I think a disgrace story, another one. I want to tell you. I think early 60s, one day, the newspaper, one of the, I think, national newspaper, mentioned one sadhu. He claimed he had the sort of power to float on water. And he sold some ticket. Then actually, more people that particular day come to watch. Suppose he demonstrate. So one because of small tent.
Pool, yeah, pool.
Hello,
there's a big container.
And filled water. Suppose he remain
above it, floating above it. Yeah.
Then he sit. But he got some money to the
Well, Your Holiness, many of these practices we've been discussing are really quite unique practices. They're practices that are not necessarily in the mainstream, and clearly they're challenging to science. And I wonder if Dr. Murthy, whether Aditya, you have any thoughts or reactions as our token physicalist.
No, I mean, well, at the outset, I'd just like to thank His Holiness and the Mind and Life for the invitation. I mean, I was born and brought up in India, and this is the first time I'm actually, sitting and actually talking very intensely with people, talking about a system that I should be very naturally comfortable with. But the truth is that a lot of my education is fundamentally from the Western system. I trained in the United States and trained in neuroscience, and in a system which I guess for young people is a bit, it's a bit, they don't encourage, to put it lightly, young scientists to talk very closely with philosophers, and if it is with philosophers, it's mostly with the Western tradition. And so, in a sense, I guess there is a lot of learning and catching up for me to do, and this has provided that forum. But having said that, I study sensory motor control. I study decision making, and the paradigm I use is very simple, and in some sense, so I'm not sure if it can necessarily contradict and inform at this plane of observations that we were just talking about. But nevertheless, it seems to me that in this community of scientists who study how decisions are made, we actually train monkeys actually to sit in front of a monitor and do very simple decision-making tasks. They may have to estimate the pattern of motion and estimate whether the motion of a stimulus is moving to the left or the right. And while the monkey is doing this task, one can actually sit down and put electrodes in the monkey's in various parts of the brain and actually record electrical activity while the monkey is making this decision. And actually, if you talk to many of the scientists, and much of this finding has actually been published, many of them intuitively have come to the realization that that much of the free will behind decision making, the intentionality, may actually not be there. And in some ways, there's a lot of congruence with, I think, Eastern philosophy that with this whole approach through meditation of actually reducing the I. And it seems to me that this notion of removing the self actually, in some sense, is already integrated and is being integrated in the current frameworks of neuroscience. And so, in a sense, and to take off further, much of this decision making is thought to be probabilistic. So, neuroscientists are realizing that these electrical activity of these neurons may not, and these could be sensory neurons, they may not reflect absolute reality in the sense of representing the stimulus itself, but really the likelihood of a stimulus being present. So here you're using a mathematical framework, a Bayesian framework, to actually say the brain is not actually necessarily certain about what is out there, but we actually in the current framework of neuroscience suggests that the possibility that really what we're doing is coming up with solutions. That is, it's not just a mapping of the world, but the brain is actively finding out what's there, and all that the neurons can do is maybe generate a likelihood, and we call that a decision. But I think in our own way we are maybe coming to some of the conclusions that are coming. We of course can't experience that. That requires meditation, but of the removal of the self. But through rational thought and empirical investigation, I think these views are not necessarily as divergent, at least to my understanding. I mean, I'm very ignorant of my own traditions, but that's in some sense what I thought I'd share.
So, in other words, Your Holiness, I think part of what's very interesting what Aditya has said is the notion that we have an appearance. It seems as if we are making choices, but much of that is actually an illusion. That the choice is already happening at a much more basic level of our mind, if you like, or at the level of the brain, and that much of our sense of being an agent, of being a jepopo, of doing things, is actually an illusion. Does this seem to correspond?
What is that? Illusion cause order.
True, but
yes.
수수 제법이지 수수랑원 그 돈에 비게 지견들 때는 돈에 제법 좀 그래서 그때 레벨 남샤고 돈 되게 제법 거기야 지게 지견질 돈에 제그 삼타에 망보지 쉐벌 것도 뭐 유변 내가 버려 땡게 잡아지 돈에 지구도 갈라 차상 말하는 당신 돈 제배 삼삼디 illusion 더 차기 그래서
다 추버스는 야 대담 먹고 싶죠. The
problem is this whole word illusion, because when we talk about illusion, it can have so many different senses.
Many levels.
Many levels.
Many levels. But you see, I feel some effective or serious actions, verbal action or physical action, even mental action, there must be motivation and intention.
Intention.
Yeah.
So without intention, these active actions cannot...
Of course, some level, of course, some itching here, my hand go there, automatically, no sort of serious sort of motivation. Of course, you need the feeling,
experience.
Then automatically my finger go there. That also physical action, but without sort of
without deliberate conscious intention.
So there are also, of course, many levels. Then I'm wondering again is a private sort of conversation now. According to the Tantrayana practice, in order to dissolution of grosser level mind, it related with chakra.
Chakras,
Nadis.
And also the vayu.
Vayu or prana.
So when you this morning, when you mentioned about some kind of clear light, so that practitioner also involved this chakra practice, or kundalini, chandalini, also.
Yeah. they talk about the 6 chakras.
Yes, that's right.
And Ramakrishna has clearly described in the Gospel, when the Kundalini goes to each of the chakras, what are the experiences that you get?
Same. So
He clearly expressed. When he went to the last, he could not express, he went into Samadhi. He has told his disciples, next time I'll go and explain even the last point. Again he tried and he came into Samadhi. Because when you go to the last, you can't explain anymore.
that's right.
Clearly the whole
That's
thing
true.
is recorded.
That's true. That's true. Very similar.
I think Wolf.
Got you?
I'm just very impressed by the experts who seem to know exactly what they mean.
Number ni kami na backup le ya, ani chigi chigi sumbu te takta chigi chigi kotu wis dos, anda tumong kita kanda chigi chemong stress.
I think you had a comment.
Yes, so, I think to come back to His Holiness' first concern, basically how can we expand our knowledge and how can we contribute something to society? So we can clearly define all those parts as a way of transforming ourselves to better transform the world or to better serve others, serve society. So now, do we need or not a process of cultivation, of practice? Well, if we naively declare, sort of a Parisian or a New Yorker busy person, just declare my work is my meditation, well, we see the state of the world. So that didn't lead very much anywhere in terms of achieving a more compassionate society. I mean, just things sort of randomly, of course, change, but the personal transformation doesn't contribute very much to that extent. So then, of course, when Swamiji said that we do nothing, but we need to do nothing with some methods, isn't it? So when you explain the methods, there are, of course, very similar points to Buddhist practice. And just to pick up a few, like to say, to de-hypnotize yourself, it certainly corresponds to the notion in Buddhist practice that most of our perceptions are deluded in the sense that we keep on superimposing our mental projection of this is, in essence, desirable, this is undesirable, this is good, this is bad, this is a friend, this is an enemy. So we fix all those labels, which are fabricated, therefore dysfunctional, and therefore leads to suffering. So to de-hypnotize or to undelude the mind is, of course, one of the main purposes. Dealing with the way thoughts arise is a crucial issue in Buddhist practice, because one thought comes, oh, he did something to me, and then it multiplies, invades your mind, and then animosity, hatred comes. So also the idea to recognize the source of the arising is present in many mind teachings, where that thought came from, now where it does it dwell, and when it has vanished, did it go somewhere? And we find that there is no such thing to find, and that somehow helps to not fall into those automatic chain reactions that perpetuate ignorance, that perpetuate delusion, that perpetuate suffering. So in those terms, there are very much similarities in the practice. So there is a practice of cultivation. Even wisdom, jnana, basically we are confused. So unless there's a process, both analytic and contemplative, to understand what are the nature of that confusion that prevents us from realizing wisdom, then it's not going to go out by itself. We need to deconstruct our misconception of reality. Independent self, the solid distinction between self and others, between me and the world, and so forth. Otherwise, we dysfunction and then we suffer. So now, in terms of what Ram said about trying to instrumentalize those differences, there's possibly one area, just out of all those that you mentioned, that might be more immediately amenable to scientific inquiry, is both the notion of less vulnerability to the ups and downs of existence. Because that's something that seems to be very common in practitioners, that they can maintain an optimal, exceptionally healthy state of mind.
这些就是光顾同这些这个中这个这个呀，期间对不起不是那么过去，拍下看就不能，这里呀都是这种其他么过的，当用给냠你这个那个就是话，这开就是都是，这大也没都是。
Sort of a balanced state of mind, balanced emotional balance, a sense of flourishing that is not possibly moksha or jivan mukti or nirvana, but it is the path leading to such freedom from the causes of suffering. So that increased or diminished vulnerability allows one to have the inner resources to deal with the changing conditions of the world, because we are not in control of the outer world. Our control of the outer condition is very limited, it's temporary and often illusory. We think we are in charge and everything collapses. So the inner conditions of genuine sort of happiness is how the mind functions. What are the mental states, like compassion, altruistic love, contentment, self-discipline, or openness and inner peace, inner freedom that can be enhanced? What are those destructive mental states like hatred, envy, arrogance, and craving that needs to be dissolved? There are techniques for that. So this needs to be cultivated because naturally we just easily the slave of those emotions. So the fact of less vulnerability also we have equivalent in Buddhist practice. We call it one taste, which is not indifference, which is not a dull state, but which precisely that although we see those very clearly, they don't carry away us into either depression or euphoria, but maintain that sense of understanding and balance. So I think it seems that it's more, there's a whole range of study in the emotional reaction of practitioner to these ups and downs of life, which will be a combination of a very vivid understanding of what's going on. So the cognitive aspect will be perfectly lucid and clear. It's not a dull state. At the same time, there will be immense faculty to deal with those ups and downs without being unsettled, maintaining one's compassion, openness to others, not retreating in self-centeredness and sort of basically selfish reactions, but that still we are not completely unsettled by what happens and maintain a sense of direction and meaning in life. So that's possibly a way that could most easily be probed to science, both psychology and neuroscience, because the science of emotions is now has a lot of progress. So that's one area. And so the whole process also could lead also eventually to better understanding of mental processes, how emotions arise, and possibly to the deeper aspect of the luminous aspect of mind, when these wild mental thoughts and emotions are a little bit more quiet, what still is there? That pure awareness, that's also an avenue of possible investigation. And so that covers many aspects of both Hindu and Buddhist practice that can at the same time keep the big picture of what can we contribute to society, and at the same time be faithful to the individual practices and to the deeper concern of transforming oneself to better transform the world.
Very good.
You know, Your Holiness, thinking of what Matthew just said, one of the commonalities that I think we've heard repeatedly, we've spoken about the nature of mind as being luminous and so on, but part of this also very much connects to the notion of self. What is, and especially there's a relationship between a certain way of understanding self or experiencing self and negative emotions, destructive behavior. I'm wondering whether this is also a very important point, or a point of contact between Buddhism and Hinduism, where that notion of the reduction of the self, which is something like selflessness, but also an expansion of the self, which is perhaps something like the realization of interdependence. I wonder, Your Holiness, if you could comment on this relationship between our notion of self and how practice works to transform our notion of self.
만세 차단 당 그 담세 전부는 대기에 너무 멈추고 강에 최고 봐. 그래서 다야고 대기에 나고 뭐 차단다 돌이야.
As I mentioned earlier, when we also the exchange views on the basis of the individual experiences and also individual views, then I think basically every phenomena has a different
Aspects.
different angles all over.
Different aspects.
One phenomena, there are many different aspects. So if you one explanation from this view, it's true. Another way explaining, that also true. So when you mentioned the Dachunju the Maverchi, the Dachumbugan Tim Dress of Sanemidu Pa, Yemidu Dress of Luzane, the Nil Samtan Tamevslane, Koyando.
For example, you spoke of the practice and the need to diminish the small self, and through a process of expanding the self and merging into the greater self. So this is a kind of a form of deconstruction of self.
Even one, my Christian friend, is the one who told me, your total submission to God, Creator, that also is some meaning of the emptiness of individual self, ego. So I always telling people, the strong faith towards Creator, towards God, another sort of different way of approach to reduce self-centered arrogance. As Buddhism say, there is no independent self. So different use different method, but more or less it's the same effect. But at meantime, of course, as I mentioned before, Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, these great, brilliant sort of Buddhist master, Buddhist sort of professors, I think when they criticize about the concept of Atma, I think they must know the other's view.
Yes.
Of course, they really took seriously and cultivate the understanding of the other position.
They got the pervasive jory, Chong and Namanamba, Gadway Nimashasaj. They touch and silly shadow. Did marry there? Chong and Nam Langni. Taka what you were mother, Chong and Namanamba, San Mari. Chong Chasang Muslim, Pandachura Lugi, the Mudik with Totu, Sensi Shian to Dalia, Tian to Dalia, Kram Mudik will Chimbuji, because of Shepchit Chinche, Richard.
So there is a Tibetan expression in the context of debate, and it says that before the dawn of the opponent's standpoint has been made clear, the sun of the criticism, the critique should not rise. So, and this is an important point. Otherwise, all of your treatment of the other's position becomes just very muddled and confused. So there needs to be a very clear understanding of what the position is that you are critiquing. So, for example, in the case of Dharmakirti, there is an anecdote of how Dharmakirti even spent 12 years as a disciple of a Hindu master, so that he could, a servant of a Hindu master, so that he could understand all the subtleties of the position before he could critique.
Some secret of the opponent. So therefore, I really feel, you see, these masters of criticism, or the critical sort of the debate. I feel they must know, out of their full knowledge, then they criticize. And within the Buddhist school of thought also, you see a lot of debate. So it's quite familiar. Meantime, respect. So that's, I think, at that time, I think the word of democracy may not be there, but you see, they practice this really democratic way. Criticize each other, but respect each other. Isn't it? So in any way, If I say, oh, we are same, then I think Nagarjuna will scold me.
Well, I see, Your Holiness.
As I mentioned earlier, you see, the personal level, see, the some don't so
So, of course, it depends. All of these standpoints and teachings, they really may appeal differently to different individuals. So whatever approach seems to be more effective to you, that is really the best way to go.
Adhikari Bheda in Vedanta, according to the eligibility and the qualification of the aspirant, the teacher gives different kinds of teachings.
The person can.
His Holiness feels that perhaps we need to make a distinction between the points of convergence at the level of practice and the experience that is being led to, and then the points of divergence on the ontological, metaphysical level. So, for example, there is Panchen Lobsang Chogyal, who in the context of the various different Tibetan schools of thought talked about how if you compare the experience of the yogis coming from these different traditions, then you will find a point of convergence.
Yeah, you're saying that.
Well, I was just seeing, Your Holiness, that it seems that our time is almost up. We have just a couple of minutes. I don't know if we have any last comments or questions for our panelists. Anyone who, I saw you had your hand up, Wolf.
Next session.
Next session. All right, very good.
That's the next session.
No.
And if Your Holiness, if you have any last reflections on this session, this is, in some ways, certainly for the Mind and Life Institute, a very historic event. It's, as you know, our first meeting in India, but also the first time in which we've engaged so directly with a non-Buddhist tradition. If you have any thoughts about the future of this dialogue or any advice about how to carry this work forward, I hope you'd take the last just couple of minutes and give us any advice you might have.
Nothing particular.
Nothing comes to my mind, yeah, right now.
Nothing. Again, you see, I always conduct, just like you see the
informal way. Informal way.
Informal zone.
Like a kind of intimate conversation.
So therefore, even 2 minutes earlier, I have to go toilet.